Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special American Brain Coalition members-only session focused on navigating advocacy opportunities in the 119th Congress. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Ross, a board member of the ABC and president of the American Neurological Association and director of the Center for Neurogenetics in the Brain and Mind Research Institute at Cornell University's Weill Cornell Medical College in New York. I'd like to turn it over to my co-moderator for a brief introduction. Mary?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Betsy, and to the ABC. I'm Mary Phillips, an a very recently joined ABC board member and a member of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. I'm the Pittsburgh Foundation Emily Endowed Chair in Psychotic Disorders and also Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry, Bioengineering and Clinical and Translational Science at the University of Pittsburgh. So the ABC and Betsy came to me recently for the idea for this very timely and important session, and I'm absolutely delighted to help start this session today. So Betsy, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Mary. As many of you know, we're working in a complex and rapidly shifting political environment. From budget constraints to evolving healthcare priorities, the stakes for brain health, neuroscience research, and patient care are incredibly high. In times like these, our collective voice is not just valuable, it's absolutely essential. This session was designed specifically for leaders like you, researchers, clinicians, academic voices, and representatives of scientific societies who play a critical role in shaping the future of brain health policy. Whether you're new to advocacy or a seasoned pro, we hope that you'll walk away with a stronger understanding of the current policy and funding landscape and how it impacts science and healthcare. Practical tools for engaging with legislators, both in Washington and at home, strategies for crafting compelling role-specific messages, and new ideas for cross-sector collaboration that can amplify your impact. We also want to mention that a companion session geared toward patient advocacy organizations will be held later this week, recognizing that all of us bring essential and complementary voices to the table. Now we're pleased to turn things over to ABC's outstanding legislative consulting team at CRD Associates. Today's presentation will be led by Senior Vice President Megan Riley. We'll leave time at the end for Q&A, but feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box through the session. Thanks again for joining us and for all you do to advance the brain health agenda. With that, Meg, I turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. And hi, everyone. Thanks for having us join you for this session this afternoon. My name is Meg Riley. I am Senior Vice President at CRD Associates, and we support ABC in their policy and advocacy work here in Washington, D.C. I'm joined by my colleagues, Nina and Lucas, who I'll let introduce themselves quickly. Nina, you want to go first?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Nina Boyle, Senior Policy Associate. Thank you, everyone, for joining today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lucas Coyle, and I am a Policy Associate at CRD Associates, and I'm excited to be sharing how to be an effective advocate with you all.
Great, thank you both. So before we get into it, just wanted to go over some of the goals that we have in the session and what you can expect to learn or understand throughout the course of the hour that we're together. And I also want to just make a blanket reminder that ABC is a nonpartisan organization, and likely many of the organizations you belong to are as well. So all of our advocacy efforts are nonpartisan as well. We engage with legislators from both sides of the aisle and make our case based on facts and using illustrative examples. So today we're going to do a few things that will be helpful to your advocacy efforts. First, understand the makeup of Congress and the current federal policy landscape, understand the legislative and appropriations processes in the current climate, learn communications tips for your legislators, and also how to use coalitions for advocacy and engage the media. So let's start first with the landscape here in Washington, D.C. To successfully advocate, we definitely need to know the challenges that we're facing with Congress and the administration and how we can include all of our advocacy efforts in the current context. So I think we have probably a range of audience members from beginners to advanced. So it's always helpful, no matter what your level of advocacy is, to get started with the basics. So some of you might consider this a refresher, but we'll just talk a little bit about Congress 101. So there's two chambers of Congress. The House of Representatives is the first one. It has 435 members and 6 non-voting delegates. Members serve 2-year terms, and they represent districts based on population. So those districts are drawn by the state's legislature or by independent commissions in the state. And again, they serve 2 terms, a 2-year term. So anytime there's a federal election, the entire House of Representatives is up for re-election unless they've decided to go on to do other things. So that has a really big impact on the decisions they make in Congress. They're very accountable to their voters in their districts because they're really always running for that next session of Congress. There are, in the other chamber of Congress, 100 senators, 2 per state, and they serve a 6-year term. So elections in the Senate are staggered, and they represent the entire state. There are 53 Republicans right now in the Senate and 47 Democrats. That includes independents who caucus with the Democrats and add to their tally. Here's the face of the 119th Congress, the faces, that is. These gentlemen might look familiar to you. They are the leadership in both the House and the Senate. So in the House, leadership remains the same right now as it was in the previous Congress, with Speaker Mike Johnson from Louisiana maintaining his role and Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries retaining his role as well. Republicans control the House, but the margin of majority there is very thin. The Republicans just swore in 2 new members of Congress, who replaced Matt Gaetz and Mike Waltz, President Trump's national security advisor, that they were elected through special elections. And then President Trump also actually rescinded his nomination of Republican Elise Stefanik from her nomination to serve as ambassador to the United Nations. The margins are so thin that the Republican administration doesn't want to lose any Republican members of the House. There are 220 Republicans right now in the House and 213 Democrats with 2 vacancies. So there will be special elections held in Arizona and Texas at some point soon to replace members who have actually passed away since the start of this Congress. And 218 is the number of seats needed, number of votes, needed if all the seats are full to pass legislation on the House floor. So as you can see, the Republican majority is really thin right now. They can only lose 1 or 2 or up to a handful of votes if they want to pass legislation on the House floor. And the 2 seats that are going to be up for special election are likely to be filled with Democrats. Those are in blue districts. So it's very tight for Speaker Johnson to pass his agenda forward, Republican agenda. In the Senate, the biggest change to the leadership there is the ascension of Senate Majority Leader John Thune from South Dakota. It's the first change on Republican leadership in the Senate in almost 2 decades because Senator Mitch McConnell held that role for a very long time and just stepped down at the end of the last Congress. And then long-serving leader Chuck Schumer still in control for the Democrats there. So in the Senate, the Republicans have control by a margin of 53, again, to 47. Under Senate rules, though, most legislation requires a 60-vote majority to advance on the floor. So the Senate, by nature, has to work together across the aisle unless they have a greater than 60-vote majority, which they don't have now. So we will see a lot of collegial work, bipartisan coordination in the Senate, typically because of that, the way their rules are structured. So again, because even though I will say the Republican Party has full control across the executive and legislative branch, it's going to be difficult for them to unilaterally move their legislation. There are cases where they have to work bipartisan basis, and in the House, they can only lose a couple of votes, but the House Republican Conference is famously diverse. So there are very far conservative folks and there are more moderates, and it's hard to group them all together and get them to vote for the same priorities. Here's just a glimpse at the healthcare and public health leaders who have taken up positions in the administration under President Trump. Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was confirmed by the Senate in February. And really quickly off the bat, he has overseen a massive restructuring and reduction in force across the Department of Health and Human Services. including agencies like NIH, FDA, and the CDC. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya was confirmed as the director of the National Institutes of Health. Some of his priorities that he has shared are for fostering a culture of free speech in science. So we know that he aims to encourage dissenting perspectives in the sciences. And he has also echoed new Secretary Kennedy's agenda that NIH should focus on research to solve the US chronic disease crisis, and has committed to carrying out the administration's Make America Healthy Again agenda. So there will be some renewed focus on chronic disease by this administration. Rounding out the healthcare leaders, Dr. Martin Makary has been confirmed to lead the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Mehmet Oz to lead the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Susan Monterez has been nominated to lead the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. She was nominated after the president pulled his nomination of Dr. Dave Weldon when folks in Congress were concerned about his vaccine skepticism, that nominee's position there. So she has not been confirmed yet by Congress, and nominated as Surgeon General is Dr. Jeanette Neshawat. So that's just sort of a picture of who's in place right now across the government or expected to be confirmed soon. So next, what has happened here in Washington, D.C. since January? It's an understatement to say a lot has happened. The moderators at the beginning said we're in a fast-paced and rapidly changing environment, and that is very true. So I hesitate to use the term unprecedented times because I feel like we've been saying that for 5 years now, and it's sort of lost all meaning. But really, what's happening here in DC has been very different than what we've experienced before. So in the first few months of the Trump administration, there have been a number of executive actions that have reverberated across the public health and research communities. We're just going to share a couple of examples. We don't want to create an exhaustive list, and I know a lot of these things are things you're following very closely. But first, the president established the Department of Government Efficiency, ostensibly led by Elon Musk, and they've had sweeping power to cut federal spending and programs, and they've been doing that for several months. Some actions that are really specific to health policy. In January, HHS implemented a communications freeze, which included hiring, communications, and travel. When it was first announced, it was a temporary freeze meant to end on February 1st, but our understanding is it is still in place. Some official communications are now getting approved and getting out, but the open back and forth communication between agency staff has not resumed fully. The administration has also prioritized a broad reduction of force across the federal workforce and a policy to hire only one person for every 4 who depart. Again, we mentioned briefly, and I will state again, there has been a sweeping restructure at HHS and a reduction in force that formally began on April 1st with a goal of shedding 20,000 jobs across the department between reductions in force and prior departures, and that includes 3,500 full-time employees from FDA, 2,400 from CDC, and 1,200 from NIH. Also in January, the administration announced a freeze on federal funding on all aid grants and loans, which was met very swiftly with legal challenges, and a temporary injunction was initiated. But we do have the Department of Government Efficiency continuing to halt spending in certain cases, and this is still moving through the courts. Another executive action very specific to NIH research was the attempt last month, or it may have been in February, to cap facilities and administration costs associated with NIH grants at 15%. Many of you are very familiar with F&A costs, and they're very important for the work you do at your institution. And we just know that this would be very damaging to ongoing research and just the work that needs to be, the resources that are needed to keep facilities like laboratories up and running. So this was also challenged in court, and a judge established a preliminary injunction. And then just the last thing we'll highlight is efforts to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the federal government, and an executive order that has required agencies to terminate DEI positions and programs and provide lists of grants and contracts related to DEI efforts and ensure that all grants and contracts are in keeping with the president's executive order to end DEI. So again, this was not an exhaustive list of executive actions, but I think a lot of these are pertinent to the work you do in health research and advocacy. Nina?
Great, thanks, Meg. So now we're going to turn to the congressional response to the administration's actions. So the actions taken so far by the administration have divided Congress pretty solidly along partisan lines. Democrats have been vocal in their opposition to these actions, while Republicans, for the most part, have stayed loyal to the president. Very surprisingly, back in January, Tom Cole, chair of the House Committee on Appropriations, pictured here, was quoted as saying that the federal funding freeze was a legitimate exercise of his executive power, and that appropriations directed by Congress are not law. So this was very surprising because Congress, and in particular appropriators, have long been protective of their authority to make federal funding decisions and hold their constitutional power of the purse. This quote here, yielding that authority to the administration was stunning and raised the question, will Congress exercise their oversight over this administration? This has been the case across a number of issues so far, including cabinet nominations, and the Republican majority in Congress has been hesitant to challenge the administration's actions. Next slide, please. Great. So, we have seen actually a few examples of legislators speaking out when issues hit close to home. So using the F&A cap as an example, members from both sides of the aisle expressed concerns about this. Here we've highlighted Senate Appropriations Committee Chair Susan Collins' response and House Appropriations Committee Ranking Member Rosa DeLaura's comments about F&A caps. So the difference here, why are they speaking out? These legislators understand that a cap on F&A risks the research done at their institutions, in their states, in their districts, and the jobs, ultimately, that this research supports and sustains. So the point here you might be seeing, and we'll discuss this more in detail when we talk about how best to advocate, but the point is that now more than ever, everything in Congress is local. It's an old saying, but it's important that when legislators understand that a policy is going to have a profound negative impact on their constituents or their voters at home, they're more likely to get in the way of it. They're more likely to make sure it works out in the best interest of their constituents. Additionally, I also want to underscore this third example we have on this slide of a bipartisan action taken in the wake of the HHS reorganization. So on April 1st, we saw the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, or the HELP Committee Chairman Bill Cassidy and Ranking Member Bernie Sanders sent a letter to Secretary Kennedy inviting him to testify before the committee to clarify the actions and to explain to Congress that as he had promised to do during the nomination. As of right now, Kennedy has not responded, but this is an important bipartisan action that recently took place. So ultimately, these examples underscore that in the climate that Meg has laid out for us, we shouldn't be expecting necessarily big policy changes or funding bumps. We shouldn't be expecting those. However, it's important to note that there are small steps that are being taken place. There are small wins. There are actions that Congress is taking. It's important to note these, work on building them, and make the most compelling and local case that we can to our legislators. Next slide.
Great. Thanks, Nina. And another important key to our advocacy is understanding the process. So here's another slide that may be a refresher, and you may recognize Bill here from Schoolhouse Rock when we were kids. But to break it down even a little more simply, a bill becomes a law through a pretty standard practice on paper. It doesn't always happen that way. Things work out quite differently in Congress, but you still need to sort of understand the basics. A member of the House or Senate introduces a policy in legislation. It's then referred to relevant committees of jurisdiction who can take action through hearings, markups, and then ultimately a committee vote. After the committee process, the full House or full Senate will vote on the bill on the chamber's floor. And then it's referred to the other chamber for consideration. Both chambers have to pass identical bills, or they have to reconcile the differences via a conference committee. And if there is a new bill negotiated through conference or other negotiations, the House and Senate must each pass the negotiated bill. Then it is sent to the president for his signature, which completes the process. Or the president could veto the measure and send it back down to Congress, and they can override the veto with a 2/3 majority vote in both chambers. There are two types of legislation. Authorization legislation creates or makes changes to federal policy. It can authorize Congress to direct funding to something specific, but no money is spent, no funds are formally allocated through authorization. That happens through the appropriations process. Authorization legislation also often covers a specific time frame. So you'll have a bill that will last maybe 3 to 5 years, and then it sunsets or expires, and the authorizing committees review it again periodically. Appropriations is the money, the funding legislation. It confers budget authority on federal departments and agencies and allows them to spend that money on the programs that Congress decides to spend it on, whether or not those programs have been authorized by Congress. The appropriations process happens annually and covers the fiscal year from October 1st through September 30th. So as advocates, you know that we're really always working on the appropriations process, always advocating for federal funding for our priorities. And I'm going to turn it to Lucas to talk a little more about appropriations.
Thank you, Meg. So this is a diagram that shows the official steps in the appropriations process. It doesn't ever work as precisely as the slide depicts. As Meg said, each fiscal year there are a lot of deviations from this plan, but this is essentially how Congress is meant to consider and approve federal funding. So from the release of the president's budget through committee markups and final passage of the bills, these steps are drawn up, and this is how it's meant to work. So just kind of walking through this, the agencies submit a budget to the Office of Management and Budget in early fall. Then the president's budget will typically be released in early February, and then Congress will work on a budget resolution. And after this, the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, will take the total discretionary funding amount and, like Med said, divide that up among the 12 subcommittees. And then these subcommittees will start making up the bills, and once they are done, they will send it up to the full Appropriations Committee for their markup. Then they will have a floor debate and votes. Then the conference committee will resolve the differences between the House and Senate if they're different, and then again get signed by the president. Next slide, please. So what has been going on in terms of appropriations? So for FY25, after being unable to finalize FY25 appropriations for nearly 6 months, on March 14th, Congress passed a long-term continuing resolution to fund the government until September 30th at FY 2024 levels. So overall, the bill included a $6 billion increase in defense spending and reduced non-defense programs by $13 billion. Now, while it keeps discretionary funding for key health agencies, NIH's base budget mostly in line with the FY 2024 levels, it includes some cuts like the scheduled decrease in mandatory funding for the 21st Century Cures Innovation Fund, which decreases funding for the Brain Initiative by $81 million. And also we saw a 57% cut to the congressionally directed medical research program, or CDMRP, at the Department of Defense, which provides grant funding to researchers studying diseases and disorders that are prevalent in service members and veterans and their families. So the FY26 process has begun, and members have opened up their submissions for appropriations requests, and these subcommittees have begun accepting written testimony to hear priorities of different stakeholders. Now, the impact of recent restructuring at HHS and other agencies on the appropriations process is still a bit unclear, but the Appropriations Committee has suggested that they will consider appropriations requests under the same structure as previous years. So that means that organizations can and should still make appropriations requests and make the case for restoring offices and programs that have been eliminated at the administration level. Now, typically, the appropriations process kicks off with the release of the president's budget in February, but in recent years, and especially in a transition year, the budget can be delayed. So we don't have the president's budget yet, but based on the other executive actions, we can anticipate that it will propose steep cuts to federal spending. We may also see a skinny budget from the administration sometime this month or next month, which is just a more stripped down version of a traditional budget. But the appropriations process has begun for FY26. And the House is expected to advance some partisan bills like they did last year, and the Senate is likely to engage in a more bipartisan process as they historically have done. Next slide.
Okay. Thanks, Lucas. Another process for changing laws is budget reconciliation. This one's been much in the news lately. It's a unique and limited legislative process that Congress is focusing on now, that the Republican majority hopes to use to advance their major policy priorities. And that's because budget reconciliation only requires a simple majority in the Senate and a limited debate. So it's often used as a process when one party has unified control over the legislative and executive branches, as Republicans do now. The budget reconciliation process allows for expedited consideration of certain tax, spending, and debt limit legislation, and it's tied to the passage of a budget resolution in both the House and Senate. So it can only be used once per fiscal year, and if you have a 2-year Congress, twice over the course of the Congress. So after the passage of a budget resolution, the House and Senate authorizing committees are given instructions to craft corresponding legislation that will carry out the priorities. So the Congressional Budget Act allows Congress to use this process for legislation that, again, changes spending, revenues, or the federal debt limit. And with respect to spending, it's focused on mandatory spending, like entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, which is formerly known as food stamps. Discretionary spending is still addressed through the appropriations process. So again, to start the process, each chamber has to adopt an identical budget resolution and then provide reconciliation instructions to the corresponding committees. And then they have to pass legislation, or they're instructed, that is, to pass legislation that must increase or decrease spending or revenues by certain amounts over a certain time period. So just quickly on the status of this, the House and Senate passed distinct budget resolutions in February with differing priorities. So they've had to come together and negotiate quite a bit since then. In recent weeks, the Senate passed a new budget resolution on April 5th, requiring $4 billion in spending cuts, $150 billion in new military spending, and $175 billion for immigration and border priorities. After a lot of negotiation and discussion, the House did pass the identical amended Senate budget resolution on April 10th. But the House was really seeking greater spending cuts, so they retained their instructions to require at least $1.5 trillion in spending cuts in the subsequent legislation that these committees are going to write. And they have sort of an informal handshake agreement with Majority Leader Thune on the Senate side that the Senate will work towards that goal as well. But this is really only one step in a very complex process. Over the next couple of weeks, authorizing committees in the House and Senate are going to get to work on writing that legislation. And we include it here because it is meant to be a sweeping piece of legislation that covers a lot of priorities, including tax, Medicaid spending, which is at risk with the sheer level of cuts that Congress is looking to make through this legislation. So it's something to really follow because it may be the one sort of omnibus piece of legislation that has the chance to get through Congress because of the specified rules for budget reconciliation. So now that we have a grasp on what's going on, what the process is, how things are working, let's talk about how to put this in action, how to work with your legislators to make the case for your priorities. Advocacy requires persistence. So we are seeing headlines like this lately. Senate office receives unusually high volume of calls in Trump's first week. like, to put it simply, the phones are ringing off the hook in the House and Senate office buildings. So often, lately when a big announcement is made or executive order comes out or legislation is being considered, everyone's calling their senator. So the volume of calls is going up. Advocates are getting busy signals. They're being redirected to voicemails. And it just seems like there aren't enough phone lines, let alone staffers on the Hill, to keep up with the demand. And if you think about the number of calls, think about how much easier it is to just click a few places and type a quick email and drop it in your legislator's constituent box. So if the call volume is this high, I think we can assume that the emails are piling up as well. So how do you get through? There's a lot of things you can do. And first, I will give a flag to all the organizations you're working with and their grassroots efforts. ABC has grassroots efforts, but so do a lot of ABC's members that I know you guys are all closely associated with. Participate in your organization's grassroots efforts. Respond to action alert emails. So while I know I did just say that emails are piling up, it's really noticeable when there are hundreds or thousands of emails going into the same office asking for the same thing. So legislators take that into consideration. They see the stack. Their staff knows, people keep writing about this issue. So when an organization that you're a part of asks you to take action, including ABC, send the email. But don't just send the email. Usually you can personalize these emails with your own stories, and you should do that. We keep going back to this. We keep talking about making it local. But when you can put your own story in there, you can put data from your own institution or information about jobs in your state or district. Do that. That gets noticed. And that's more likely to change an individual legislator's mind than just seeing the volume of identical letters. So use that customization process when you can. If your organization invites you to participate in their Capitol Hill Day, either in person or virtual, really try to attend. These events are important on the day of because they bring awareness and visibility to an issue during a point in time. But they also, probably more importantly, serve as an inroads to build relationships with your congressional offices. Get to know the staff that you meet with during these events. Take their business card, follow up with them by email, and start a dialogue. You don't want to just know them, but you want them to recognize you and recognize your story when something you're working on comes up in their office. It comes up in their work and they say, oh, I met with somebody about this. I'm going to call that person. So as you're starting that dialogue, as you're keeping in touch with these staffers, also keep the organizations that you're working with in the loop. They can be very helpful as resource with follow-up materials as you try to build those relationships. Also, again, I said the phones were ringing off the hook, but make the phone call. Don't be left out of the noise and be persistent. If you don't get through, call again, leave a voicemail, ask for a response. If you've been fortunate enough to make a relationship with a staffer, ask for them directly, see how you can connect with them directly. Offer yourself not only as advocating for an issue, but as a resource. How can you help them? What do they need to better understand the things you're working on? And there are efforts you can do back in the district, even if you feel removed from Washington, D.C. Members of Congress are always making their way back home to meet with their constituents and their voters. And that's why we put this calendar up here on the slide. The white spaces are when both the House and Senate are out of session. So then you can expect your legislators to be home. We're at the start of a 2-week recess right now. So when you know that these recesses are happening, and you can find this calendar online as well, see what your legislators are up to, and if you can get in touch with them. Schedule in-person meetings in the district and state offices. Look for your legislators' public calendars. Are they hosting town halls? Are they participating in community events? Show up to those events and share your concerns and share your stories. You might see town halls on the news. They can become pretty heated at times, but be respectful. These public events with your legislators are an opportunity for advocacy, and you can advocate both passionately and respectfully. And that is how you're going to change minds. It's through facts and examples. It's, again, because advocacy is not partisan, You want to meet with your legislator, no matter who it is who's representing to you. And the way you change the mind of someone who might not share your position is through thorough background research, illustrative examples, personal stories, and making them understand the impact on the constituents they represent. So throughout all of this, also think about how you can find common ground with those legislators that might not right away support what you're advocating for. Because advocacy, while it is about advancing a particular agenda, it's also about looking for compromise and making incremental changes. So where can you find that common ground with a legislator? I'm going to turn it back to Lucas.
Thanks, Meg. So now we'll talk about a little bit about telling your story. So in every advocacy situation, your story is the most important tool in your toolbox. So you really want to frame your message and strategy and indicate what you want and why, and really tie your story into that. So it's really important to make it local. Who exactly will this help? And we really emphasize that an effective advocacy strategy combines both the data and also how that connects with personal stories. But the personal stories are what create that emotional connection that really resonates with lawmakers. So why is crafting your story important? Sharing real life experiences helps policymakers see the human impact behind their policy decisions. A well-told story can also break down complicated topics, making them easier for legislators to grasp and act upon. As an example, you should keep in mind that you are the expert on the issues you are advocating for. So staffers in members' offices may be familiar with the field or topic, but are most likely less knowledgeable on your specific topic area. So again, the blueprint really is to share how the issue affects you, your community, or those you represent. Explain the obstacle or harm caused by current policies or lack of action, and then clearly state the policy change or support you are advocating for and how it can make a difference. Next slide, please. So as I touched upon a little, when communicating with your legislators, it's really important to make your case local. So elected officials are accountable to their constituents. And at the end of the day, legislators have to be able to defend their actions to their constituents. And if they can't, then they risk not getting reelected. So it's key to connect the dots between policy decisions made in DC and the real world outcomes for the people in their districts. So to those with advocacy experience, making a local connection with your advocacy requests will sound pretty familiar. However, the current landscape is making this even more important. And in the past, legislators made their priorities clear through public announcements, and these announcements usually included a reference to the state or district they represent. And in the current political environment, some legislators are a little quieter or even backing away from policies and priorities, even those that have had long-held bipartisan support. So for congressional Republicans who might disagree with President Trump on some issues, there is a fear that the administration will seek some sort of retribution against that individual. And as a result, if an administrative action negatively impacts something in a representative or senator state or district, there have been reports of these legislators back-channeling to protect or save programs or economic interests for their constituents back home. So this is really to say that there is a chance that your legislators will quietly use their contacts to protect local interests, and therefore they need to truly understand what those local interests are. And in a moment, we're going to talk about how to best tell your story during congressional meetings. But some questions to consider as you think about making your case. Who will it help in your state and district? And really, what is the data to demonstrate the impacts to your state or district? Next slide.
Great. Thanks. Awesome. Thanks. So many of you advocate for the NIH. So I think it's a great example to use to expand on this jobs and economy angle that Lucas mentioned in that last bullet. So as many of you know, NIH supports the U.S. economy. It drives and sustains our local economies, members' local districts and states. As Lucas explained, when sharing your story, it's best to make your case local. So on this slide, here's some information from a recent study by the group United for Medical Research. We think this is a helpful resource to you in your advocacy, and this slide will of course be available in the recording of the webinar sent to participants. So looking at this data, so based on this study, NIH grants in 2024 generated $195 billion in economic activity in FY24. They supported almost 408,000 jobs nationwide, and each dollar in rewards translated to return on investment of $2.56. That's just a phenomenal return on an investment. I think that's a really powerful stat. This data demonstrates, that not only is NIH, as we all know, the world's premier health research agency, driving scientific advances that save lives and improve health, but the NIH is also an economic powerhouse, creating jobs and fueling economic activity in communities across the country, as well as driving innovation that supports America's global leadership. So this is just one example, right, of the jobs and economic angle that you can weave into your story and into your meetings. But our bottom line here is communicating how to demonstrate the local impact to your legislators, demonstrating how federal programs ultimately translate on the local level. So in your advocacy, please tell legislators, how NIH supports your state or institution. As Meg mentioned, it's important to customize and reference data that it applies to you specifically. If you and your colleagues are recipients of NIH funding, share how recent actions have impacted your colleagues' works. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So putting this all into action. So meeting with congressional offices. So if you're able to secure a meeting, whether it's in the DC office, the state or district office, or virtually via Zoom, make sure to do your homework first. A quick search of the staffer will help you find their LinkedIn page and give you some insight into their areas of specialty and the content of their legislative portfolio. So things like their education, what degrees they might have, if they have any posts about specific legislation, that'll all give you an idea of how familiar they might be with your issues, what background they're bringing, and kind of what mindset they might be bringing to your meeting. That's all good homework, good research to do. So another thing you can do is a quick search of your member's website. You might have already found this by scheduling them, when you schedule the meeting, but you'll see on the website a list of their legislative priorities, what they champion, their committee and caucus assignments, a list of their press releases, any news articles they've flagged, their social media pages, and how to get in touch with them and where their office is located. That's all also important to kind of gather before you go into a meeting, just so you're prepared. So then what can you expect for the meeting? So typically the meeting is scheduled for anywhere between 15 to 30 minutes, although a staffer might tell you up front that they only have a certain amount of time for the meeting. That's very common. That's not them being rude. That's the nature of their busy schedule. So we encourage you to ask the staffer at the top of the meeting, how much time do they have, so you can plan accordingly and give your elevator pitch if needed instead of taking the whole 30 minutes. So the tone also, I think it's important to say the tone should be conversational, right? There's no need to be scared of the staffers. They want to hear from you. It's their job to hear from constituents, listen to you, and ask you questions. So to that end, please welcome questions. Ask them, tell them that you invite questions and you're there to have a dialogue. If they ask you something, that you can't answer, that's the perfect opportunity to follow up and keep the conversation and dialogue going. As Meg said, you want to be able to serve as a resource to them, right? So that's a great opportunity to keep that relationship going. So when you deliver your ask, keep in mind what Lucas shared about crafting your story and making it local to your state or district. I'll also say, it's important to be concise and stay on topic. You've done all this research and you've created, you're working on these asks that you want to deliver to the office. It's important to stay on topic, stay on message. It's also important to remember that these aren't political meetings. This isn't the place to talk about campaigns, financial contributions, or say if you did or didn't vote for the member. That's not really in place for these meetings. So finally, remember to thank the staffer and send a follow-up email. These two steps will, again, help you keep the dialogue going and these relationships going. Also, as I mentioned, the follow-up is a great opportunity to share your asks and any materials you have and any items that you promised during. Next slide.
Great. And there's other groups that you can work with, and you can also direct your advocacy towards the media. So let's talk about that a little bit. First, if you're on this webinar, I know you know what a coalition is, and you know the importance of coalitions with respect to advocacy. You're members of the American Brain Coalition, so you know the value of coalitions in advancing advocacy agendas. But just to go over that with a little bit of a finer point, coalitions are formal or informal groups of like-minded organizations or individuals united to, again, advance a common goal. ABC, as you know, is the leading coalition bringing together diverse voices and perspectives across the brain health community to advocate for policies that will advance a better understanding of the human brain. Coalitions can be very valuable on Capitol Hill. For example, instead of going to a Hill meeting by yourself and sharing one story or perspective, a coalition might be able to convene a whole host of voices, like bring together research professionals, clinicians, patient advocates to all share their point of view on the same piece of policy. For example, ABC in the past has organized Capitol Hill meetings that bring together these exact voices to advocate for the BRAIN Initiative, and those have been very helpful in ABC's advocacy effort. There are a lot of coalitions in the advocacy space, and each has their own goals and objectives. Coalitions don't exist to advance every item for every member's agenda, but they are formed to bring voices together on specific goals and issues. So your organization may be a member of multiple coalitions, and you work with the appropriate one as opportunities arise. And coalition work, I'll also say, is two-sided. You get a lot of value from being in the coalition itself, but it's important to add value as well. Coalitions need their members for their expertise, for their research resources, and need their members to volunteer when opportunities like meetings, for example, arise. And you can engage with the media, both traditional and social media, through a few key ways. First, placing a letter to the editor in a local paper can really catch the eye of your policymaker. They're combing through the local publications all the time. They want to know what their constituents are saying and what their voice is on particular policies that are in the news. So letters to the editor are typically tied to a piece of news that has recently appeared in the publication. So I know you're all already on the lookout for news like that. When you see something, it might be an opportunity to pen that letter and try and get it inserted into the publication itself. Do your research first. Most publications have guidelines for length and for what you need to include. They're probably no more than 200 words. Letters to the editor are pretty short, so you have to get your message across succinctly. And make sure when you're submitting them, you respond within a week of the story that appeared, and also include your contact information with your submission because they may need to reach out, confirm something, and get in contact with you if they are going to place that letter. Probably the next step up from letters to the editor are op-eds. These are opinion columns. They're a little bit longer, but still succinct, about 750 to 800 words. And op-eds should have a clearly defined point of view, but be backed up by facts and data. So make that compelling argument, and you've got more word space to back it up. It's a bigger lift than a letter to the editor, but it provides you more space to make fact-based background, illustrative examples, quotes, and background research. And the process to get it in the publication is also a little more complex than op-eds. This is an area where you may have to pitch it to the editorial staff of the publication. If your organization or institution has a media department, I would really encourage you to work with them, look to them for guidance and assistance. There are also online resources that can help you if you're interested in op-eds, like the op-ed project. There are tips online. And then, work with your institutions and organizations to engage traditional media. Again, this is somewhere where you work with your organization's media department. They have relationships with reporters. They're talking to these folks all the time. Make yourself available to them. Maybe they can use you as an expert, as a spokesperson, use you to provide a quote. If you see articles that you think your institution should be engaging on, share those with your media team because they may know that reporter and they may be able to pitch a follow-up story or something like that. So it's kind of a heavy lift to work with the media. That's why most organizations and institutions have a team to do it. So be a resource to that team, see how you can help them in their work. And I think we'll end talking a little bit about social media. So I'm going to hand it back to Lucas.
Yeah, and we've truly seen the power of social media in policy in recent times. And really, the fact of the matter is, the more people support an issue, the more eyes it will get. And social media can be used in a variety of ways, engaging people at your local community, engaging with your peers in your institution or field, and even members of Congress to support a policy or advocate against it. So there's quite a few platforms that can be leveraged nowadays, including X, LinkedIn, Instagram, etc. And I know that there are probably some folks here who may not have a TikTok or used it before, but this is where leveraging the younger generation comes in handy, which even now members of Congress have done with the platform specifically. So some examples, are tagging a member office that you met with on LinkedIn, and sometimes the staffers in these offices will even ask you to do so. Another example is just simply reposting relevant news and highlighting the impact, or reposting other organizations' advocacy efforts on LinkedIn. Also, making short videos or infographics on the impacts of certain policies, because lawmakers certainly do appreciate something that's visual and easily digestible. And oftentimes, a video format is just much more convincing. So, just some tips and tricks for getting started. If you haven't already, follow your elected officials, be active, and be up to date on what they're doing, and keep your messaging short. Social media has a short attention span, and it's important to be concise. And again, use photos and visuals whenever you can, and tying back to making it local, make it clear that you are a constituent, and it's something that impacts you or the people that you represent. Next slide.
Great. All right, well, that is all from us. Thanks, Lucas, and thanks, Nina, for the presentation. We are happy to answer some questions, so I'll hand it back to the moderators, and I think I'll take down the slides so that we can kind of have all our videos up.
Well, thank you very much. Betsy, did you want to go first? Or I think there's a question in the Q&A, actually a couple of questions that have emerged in the Q&A. So perhaps we should ask one each.
Absolutely. Why don't you begin?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's a simple, well, not simple, but a factual question going back to one of the earlier slides. I think, I can't remember whether it's Megan, Lucas, or Nina. What exactly is a budget resolution again? I think this is an important point because obviously budget resolutions are very powerful and not all of us know the difference between that and a more standard appropriation. So perhaps you could just run through briefly the difference.
Yeah, of course. And a budget resolution, it's really in the news right now because of the budget reconciliation process. The budget resolution itself is just a small component of that. So the House and Senate, and Lucas showed this on the slide with respect to the appropriations process, the House and Senate are meant to pass a budget resolution for every fiscal year that outlines the chamber's priorities in terms of funding for that coming fiscal year. They don't always actually do it, and the budget resolution is not a binding thing. So nothing really actually happens if they don't pass a budget resolution every year. That said, the budget reconciliation process, which the Republican Congress has really hinged all of their priorities on, they're sort of putting all of their eggs in the budget reconciliation process basket. That does require the budget resolution, to pass. So while it's not binding with respect to funding, it is the mechanism that allows Congress to move forward with budget reconciliation. So again, it's that non-binding resolution that outlines certain priorities. With respect to the budget reconciliation process, it will be accompanied by instructions to the authorizing committees to build that subsequent piece of legislation that Congress will move through budget reconciliation. It's a really complex process, so I don't know if I'm doing it justice with the time that we have, but hopefully that helps answer the question.
Thank you very much. Betsy, perhaps you want to bring up one of the other Q&A questions.
Yeah, we have some wonderful questions coming in. One that I think is rather important is that there's a question about institutions having advised us against individual stand-up public statements. And we've talked about safety in numbers. What do you think the individual might risk in advocacy, and what's the best way to approach?
Sure. And I think this is an interesting question that we're getting more often now than in previous Congresses. I mean, I think there is so much going on with the administration in Congress that can have a profound impact on institutions and organizations, that there is a legitimate fear that if we advocate too hard, we're going to be, kind of left out, or maybe there will be some sort of quote unquote punishment. And, you don't want to see that. And that's not what we hope for in advocacy. But I would say advocacy is all the more important in times like these. And it's the way that you advocate. We don't, advocacy is not something where we confront individuals personally about, we don't like what this person is doing. Advocacy is about the issue and the policy. Again, it's nonpartisan, it's fact-based, it's sharing personal stories, and that all still really remains important. But I understand where the questioner is coming from, that there are times when you don't want to be the one that stood up and be used as an example. So I think look for the coalitions that are doing the work that you want to do and be part of them. But I would also say it's not the time to back down from advocacy either. It's just the time to make sure you're making the right considerations when you do that advocacy. And this administration is going to be in place for 4 years. This Congress is in place for at least 2 years. And the most important thing about advocacy is relationship building as well. So you want to make sure whatever it is that you're saying at any time, you're not alienating any part of the government, and you're instead making inroads and making relationships there. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. So there are a couple of kind of related questions, really more about communication style. Sort of one half of the question is, what actually is the most effective way of communicating? Is it face-to-face, email, social media, or whatever? And the other sort of related question is, okay, we choose our medium. Can you give us hints as to how to sort of bring scientific complex language into language that is appropriate for advocacy? Because we're not, as scientists, we're not used to talking in advocacy terms all the time, of course. So perhaps answering the sort of the medium, but also the language at the same time. What would you advise us to do?
So do you want to go ahead, Lucas?
Yeah, I was going to start on the first point. I think you can engage on all those, and they're all special in their own way. I think face-to-face is obviously the best because you get to meet with the staffers and you're establishing that connection in person. But obviously, certainly emails and contain that personal connection, they still do that. And you keep that open line of communication. And social media is also unique in that you can have that group support. All of them I think are effective, and at the end of the day, it's a numbers game. And like I said before, they see people advocate for it. And the more they see that, the more likely they'll act on it.
Right. And I would just add, the advocacy that is effective is the advocacy that you do. So whatever is available to you, do that, try that, work on that. If something's not available to you, like a face-to-face meeting, something else will catch the eye of your legislators. That's why we wanted to go over all of these options, so that you can select the thing that's right for you in any given time. And I think we're at time, and I know we wanted to say, like, how can we break down scientific language into advocacy? And maybe that's a whole separate training on its own, but I would just really encourage, again, it's the personal story more than it is the day-to-day science that you're conducting.
Yeah.
So if I can just, maybe that's the last word on that, as we run out of time.
Well, thank you very much. We are, in fact, at time. And I just wanted to say big thank you to the CLD Associates for such a wonderful, really informative, I've learned a lot, presentation today. And I hope everybody else learned so much as well. I just also want to highlight the fact that the ABC is continuing, obviously, to support all the advocacy efforts. And if anybody has any questions that unfortunately we didn't have time to answer, please reach out to the ABC, and then we'll do our best to answer the questions. And the final point is that this session that I'm going to make is that this has been recorded and will be shared, and we're going to encourage everyone to forward it to people who couldn't attend who might be interested. So Betsy, I'll hand over to you for the final comments.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you again for using your powerful voice to champion neuroscience on Capitol Hill and beyond. And many of us on this webinar are physicians treating patients on a daily basis. Perhaps the most uplifting stories that we can provide is the wonderful advances that neuroscience and neurology is providing to our patients. I think that emphasis can be a very powerful message as we go through our advocacy efforts. And thank you so much for joining in.